Today's lesson is on the Constitution, and we're going to pay particular attention to Article 2, the executive branch. Before I begin talking about Article 2, the executive branch, I want to just remind everybody of the fact that the Constitution was ratified in 1787 amidst tremendous quandary between essentially two factions, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And they finally decided, after much query, to create a system which would provide for a strong central government and create essentially a separation of power system where, through the separation of powers, we would be able to check and balance the powers of the other branches with the intent of preventing or putting a further protection on a possible tyrant. So, Article 1 deals with the legislative branch, and today's lesson, like it says, on Article 2, the executive branch. Well, the Article 2, according to Article 2, Section 1, the person who would be in charge of the executive branch would be the President of the United States. Now, this President was not at all like the President of the United States in Congress assembled. Keep in mind that the latter, the President of the United States in Congress assembled, would be probably closer to a modern-day Speaker of the House of Representatives. He pretty much presided over meetings that the Continental Congress would actually have. Okay, so this president would be very different. And part of this difference lies in the roles of the president. According to Article 2, the President of the United States shall be Chief of State, and under this role, the President of the United States would serve as the head of state. Examples of that, when he would exercise the role of head of state, would certainly include when he would visit other countries for the purpose of negotiation or compromise, or when he would attend, for an example, a funeral of foreign dignitaries. The Chief of State is a ceremonial role. Now, what's very interesting about Chief of State is if you look at the British model. The British model is very different than the United States. These roles in the United States are somewhat merged, or they come together. In Great Britain, they're separated. So the Chief of State here over in Great Britain would be simply the monarch, okay, or one of the monarch's representatives. In this case, the Queen, or the Prince, or somebody designated from the family. But in the United States, Chief of State is merged into the President. The second major role is Chief Diplomat. Under this role and responsibility, the President serves as a major diplomat for the United States. It is he that negotiates treaties, but please keep in mind the Senate must ratify the treaties. But if for some reason the Senate doesn't ratify the treaties, as part of this balance of power, the President can call it an executive agreement. Calling it an executive agreement basically gives the same letter and the same force, but does change some of the conditions. Third, this is the one scholars you're probably most familiar with, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. Now, this is a rather curious and interesting role. So let's go into the discussion of Commander-in-Chief a little bit more. The President doesn't really engage in any combat as Commander-in-Chief. The only exception, of course, to this rule was George Washington. As President, he did involve himself directly in combat. Okay? Now, how do you know he's Commander-in-Chief? Well, he can send, certainly, troops abroad. He can turn around and, subject to the War Powers Act, which pretty much superseded a lot of what Article 1, Section number 8 deals with, which is the Congress's right to declare war. The President can send in troops. Now, he must notify Congress of this, and within a certain limited period of time, if Congress says no, he must pull those troops out. But, it's sort of interesting, scholars, because while this has been on the books and largely came about as a result of Vietnam and this expansive presidency, which really proliferated during the Vietnam War years, nonetheless, it's easier to send the troops in than it is to get the troops out. So I do want you to be more aware of that. It's really a rather important point. Fourth, besides being chief of state, he is chief executive. Now, this role here means, simply put, that he's in charge of the executive branch. Now, the president, because of the founding fathers' fear that the president, theoretically, if you got the wrong element sitting in the White House, could basically derail the entire political system and derail the separation of powers model. So the founding fathers infused a mechanism to further safeguard this, introducing for your notes and your information the Electoral College. Now, the Electoral College would be the same number of members that sit in the House of Representatives, and the Senate would be the formula that would be used. Subject to the 1961 Constitutional Amendment, which gave the District of Columbia electoral representation. You see, dear scholars, the problem with the District of Columbia prior to 1961, as it is today, the model is based on statehood. The District of Columbia is not a state, never was at all a state. So what exactly is it? It's treated more like a city. So, if it's treated like a city, and there are houses down there, and you can actually live down there and take up residence, prior to 1961 there was no electoral voice that you would have. So you'd have to either maintain joint citizenship or scrap the idea that you have any kind of definitive say in who would become the President of the United States. So back to this Electoral College. So, how the Electoral College would work is the first person to get a simple majority of electoral votes would become the President of the United States. Now, this is pretty much how the system has operated. Right now, how it works, ladies and gentlemen, is we have 535 electoral votes plus 3. Let me turn to the 535. 535 is very basic. There's 435 electoral votes in the House of Representatives, 1 for each one. Now, they're not the actual people that sit in the House of Representatives. It's aligned with, meaning the same number as. So there's 435 members in the House of Representatives, so part 1 of the equation is 435. We have 100 senators. There are 2, regardless of state size, so it's 2 times 50 is 100, so we have 535. Now, under the Constitutional Amendment that was introduced in 1961, we were going to treat the District of Columbia only for electoral representation purposes as if it was a small state. So, very simply, we're going to add 2 plus 1, or 3. And we take 3, we add to 535, we get 538. So, in order to capture the presidency, you need a simple majority. Simple majority is 50% plus 1. Or in this case, scholars, 270. So the way it reads is the first candidate to get 270 electoral votes becomes our nation's president. Now, through time, we've had some unusual elections where we were not able to get a simple majority. So, for an example, the election of 1800 witnessed such a situation, and we also saw the problem in the election of 2000. 2000 was a sort of a special case. You might recall that that was the famous case that featured Al Gore running on the Democratic side and George W. Bush, that's right, running on the Republican side. The way the system worked was all the votes got counted with the exception of the state of Florida. Now at that point, Florida had 25 electoral votes. And it was up to Florida to decide which way it was going to go. There was a number of mishaps in Florida. Finally, it went to the Supreme Court, and after recounting, it was declared that the electoral votes would swing toward George W. Bush. So that whoever got the vote in Florida would become our nation's next president. Despite the fact that the reality situation, Al Gore got the popular vote. So I just want you to be aware of that. Qualifications for president, you have to be at least 35 years of age, 14 years a U.S. citizen, and he must be a natural born citizen, or the candidate. Right now I say he because we've had no she's. In terms of the succession of the presidency, if the president dies in office or resigns, the vice president, of course, president of the Senate, becomes president of the United States, and finishes the unexpired term of the previously elected president. If for some reason the vice president doesn't qualify, the Speaker of the House would be next in order, and if after that would fall to the President pro tempore of the Senate, then after that to each of the cabinet level positions in the order in which that particular cabinet position was created. So the first one would be the Secretary of State. Okay? Fact of the matter is, we've never gotten into that point at all. Now, there's also one other thing when we talk about exceptions, which is worthy of mention without going into too much detail. But we did have an interesting person sit in the White House who never went through the means of the Electoral College. Yes, you guys should know it was our nation's 38th President of the United States. Answer, Gerald Ford. You might recall that Gerald Ford became president under the most bizarre set of circumstances our nation had ever encountered. What had happened really rolls back to a few years before 1974. And it really starts in 1972. And in 1972, Richard Nixon had been president, and he had chosen McGovern as his vice president. Now, McGovern got himself involved in rather shady operation when he was governor of the state of Maryland years before. And the shady operation was he avoided paying income tax. So the government finally caught up with him, and in a plea bargain deal, Spiro Agnew was basically asked to resign, pay off all the debt and the fines that he owed to the government directly, and in exchange for that he wouldn't have to go to jail. So he pretty much accepted that. It was a pretty good deal for him. So that's what happened. Now that created a vacancy in the vice presidency. But in 1967, 68 time period, the 25th Amendment was placed onto the books. And what the 25th Amendment said, which was really different than times past, if there was ever a vacancy in the vice presidency position, the president must appoint a successor subject to a simple majority vote of both houses of Congress. Okay? So Nixon found himself, after McGovern resigned, in this position for the very first time. So Nixon chose as his replacement Gerald Ford. Now, Gerald Ford had been in the House. He had made a career in the House of Representatives, and he was formerly House Majority Leader. So all of a sudden, Ford found himself thrusted into the position of being vice president. When Richard Nixon resigned due to the Watergate crisis on August of 1974, he leaves office. Jerry Ford, Vice President Ford, becomes President of the United States. So he is the only one. Now, of course, former President Ford, just recently passed on. I think it was maybe like 18 or 20 months ago. I'm not quite sure. But, he was the only one who ever made it into that position. All right, salary really quickly. These days, the President of the United States makes $400,000. Plus, he gets Secret Service protection. And both as president and as former president and his wife received Secret Service protection for quite a period of time after they leave office. So let's now talk quickly about the powers of the president. He's got military power, he's got treaty power, power to make appointments, power over executive departments, the power of pardon and reprieve, and filling vacancies. In the case of pardon, we saw that case with Gerald Ford pardoning his predecessor, Richard Nixon. Duties of the president. The president, according to Article 2, Section 3, must deliver a State of the Union address from, and I shall quote the Constitution, from time to time. He has the right to call special sessions of Congress together. He has veto power. He can receive ambassadors. He executes the law. We talked about that a little bit before. He's commander-in-chief. He's chief diplomat. He's chief of state. And of course, like I told you, he has judicial powers, including the right of pardon and reprieve. A pardon means he forgives a person who is convicted of a crime and essentially frees him from any sentence, which of course calls into question the pardon of Richard Nixon, because do understand, scholars, Nixon was never ever convicted. But nonetheless, the pardon was full, it was absolute, and carried the weight of law. And please be aware of that. Article 2 talks about impeachment and removal from office, and does do a number of interesting amendments which are associated with the powers of the president. First, we have Amendment 20, which is the lame duck, The lame duck amendment was ratified in 1933 and basically seriously just changes the length of service from March the 4th, which was originally under the Constitution, to January 20th, which means the new president takes the oath of office on January 20th. The reason for this obviously was that we say it's lame duck because the old president, and this is more indicative when you have a new party coming into the White House, okay? So that, for an example, when we went from George W. Bush over to our current president, Barack Obama, obviously Bush was Republican, Barack Obama was Democrat. When the nation decided that was going in favor of changing the course over to President Barack Obama, the issue under the old system was from November until March, Bush would have still remained president, and through that time period when he's trying to get legislation pushed through Congress, the Congress is aware he's no longer really going to be the president, so that really does influence how they behave. So frequently people don't get the support that they needed. So indeed this amendment helped to tighten up the time. Well, why was it there in the first place? Answer, scholars, back in the time of the early days, our transportation was difficult. Our communications was difficult. So we needed more time to make the transition happen. Those times are long gone, bottom line. So now we have a situation where the new president can really take the oath of office and get going with the things in government. Amendment 22 for your notes, 1951. This limits the president from serving more than 2 terms. This came about, of course, largely because of Franklin D. Roosevelt, who you might have recalled was president during the Great Depression and World War II years, and if you recall, served 3 complete terms, was elected to a 4th term, and then died in office, a little bit into his 4th term. So that's how that came about. It was ratified in 1951. Amendment 23 we talked about already, gave the District of Columbia electoral representation, 1961. And Amendment 25, I think I mentioned to you guys earlier, disability and succession to the president, again, enacted in 1967. Okay, that concludes today's lesson really on the executive branch focusing attention on the president.